As I stated earlier, constructing arguments makes it easier to compare and contrast our moral reasoning and helps us avoid the traps that relying on emotion and opinion alone creates. What we want to do is make sound deductive arguments or cogent inductive arguments. There are two aspects to a sound argument. The argument must be valid, meaning that the conclusion must follow from the premises in such a way that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. When we have a valid argument with true premises, we have a sound argument. Let's look at our first example, as it is sound. It is a valid argument and the premises are true, making the conclusion true. Our first premise, all men are mortal, is true. Our second premise, Socrates is a man, is also true. Our conclusion, that therefore Socrates is mortal, follows from the premises because by being a man, Socrates has the quality of being mortal. And because the premises are true, the conclusion is true. Inductive arguments, because they rely on likelihood, are not said to be valid or sound. Rather than saying an inductive argument is valid, we say it is strong when its conclusion follows from the premises in such a way that if the premises are true, the conclusion is probably true. Should the premises be true, we say the inductive argument is cogent rather than sound. Cogent's root meaning is in the Latin word for compel, thus a cogent argument is a compelling or believable argument. Looking at our example, we make an assumption in our first premise that most dogs are friendly to people, and again, experience can tell us that this is reasonable if it is not always 100% the case. We introduce a specific example in Victor the dog and conclude that since Victor is a dog, he is most likely friendly to people. Again, with inductive arguments, we are not necessarily seeking a certain conclusion. If we accept the first premise as true, and if we meet Victor and see that he is indeed friendly to most people he meets, then our second premise is proved true. Thus our conclusion follows from our premises, and as the premises are proved true through experience, our conclusion must also be true. The reason these arguments are sound or cogent is because of the form they take. Our book highlights three of the most common argument forms: Modus Ponens, Modus Tollens, and the hypothetical syllogism. All are conditional forms, meaning that if something is the case, then something else must be the case. They follow the if-then construction, with the then serving as a condition for the if. Let's look at Modus Ponens first. Modus Ponens is Latin and means to affirm the antecedent, the if part of the conditional statement. In the language of symbolic logic, it follows the form if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Now take a look at the example, a rewritten version of our very first example. If Socrates is a man becomes the antecedent. Then Socrates is mortal becomes the consequent. So our first premise is a conditional statement. If Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Our second premise affirms the antecedent. Socrates is indeed a man. Because we have confirmed the antecedent, we can now affirm the consequent. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. You can put anything in the place of P and Q and the argument will always be valid. However, remember that validity requires only that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. So you can put in false premises and reach a false conclusion and still have a valid argument. Let's try this again with another form, Modus Tollens. Modus Tollens means to deny the consequent. It takes the form if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Again, taking a modified version of our first example, our first premise, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is not mortal, therefore Socrates is not a man. Put simply, if the condition is not met, then the original clause cannot be met. If Socrates is a man, he must necessarily be mortal. If he does not meet that condition, if he is not mortal, then he cannot be a man. The conclusion follows directly from the premises, and so the argument is valid. No matter what we put in place of P and Q, remember, the argument will always be valid. It may not be sound, meaning that one or more of the premises could be false, as we saw previously, and the conclusion could either be true or false. But either way, the conclusion will not follow from the premises. So remember, in forming your arguments, to separate the notions of validity and truth. First, look at the form. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Then look at content. are the premises verifiable, or are they compelling enough to justify the conclusion? Now let's look at the third form covered in our text, the hypothetical syllogism. This too, like the others, is a conditional form, and being a syllogism, it has three statements. That's what a syllogism is. It follows the form if P, then Q, if Q, then R, therefore, if P, then R. More simply explained, in order for P to be the case, then Q must also be the case. And if Q is the case, then R will also be the case. P and R are connected via their relationship to Q. Thus we conclude that if P, then R. In this example, we see that if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Being mortal is thus a condition of being a man. If Socrates is mortal, then he can be killed, because being killed is a condition of being mortal. We can connect the dots to see then that if Socrates is a man, and is thus necessarily mortal, then he can be killed. Again, as with other forms, any argument in this form will always be valid, though not necessarily sound. Our text also shows us two invalid forms of arguments, common mistakes that are made in everyday reasoning. These forms look like the others and can sometimes result in true conclusions, making them all the more difficult to spot as imposters. In example 8, we deny the antecedent as a means of also denying the consequent. So our first premise, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal, is true. Our second premise, Socrates is not a man, is false. Our conclusion, that Socrates is not mortal, is also false. This appears to be acceptable because we have one false premise, thus our conclusion should be false. However, the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Just because Socrates is not a man does not mean he is not mortal. All men are mortal, however, all mortal beings are not men. Any living creature is mortal. Thus, even though Socrates is not a man, we cannot assume that he is not some other type of living being, and therefore mortal. The same reasoning follows for the next example. Just because Socrates is mortal does not mean he is a man. He could be any number of living beings. The lesson here is that the form of an argument is extremely important, every bit as important as the content. What we want to construct are arguments that are sound, meaning valid in form and true in content, or cogent, strong in form and probably true in content. This task is harder in dealing with moral arguments, because very often we cannot rely on fact or documented experience alone to make our case. In forming our moral arguments, we must follow the rules of logic in order to keep our moral discourse reasoned and aimed at finding truths. Every moral argument must have at least one non-moral premise, some fact or documentable evidence. Our work here is to help you reflect on your own moral principles, for each principle you hold is the conclusion to a moral argument. You simply have to surface the premises of those arguments, and the only way to do that is to look deep inside yourself and ask yourself why you hold your moral beliefs, what reasons or evidence have led you to them. Moral principles are as varied as we are, and moral discourse is made difficult because some moral principles we hold for ourselves and some we believe apply universally, and often we find ourselves in conflict, not only with others, but also ourselves. As an example, do you know anyone who is pro-life and pro-capital punishment? Vegetarian but wears leather? Conflicting ideas don't make us hypocrites. They simply show the complexity of us as individuals. Our work here is not to tear down the thoughts of others, but to learn more about why we believe what we do, to give us the tool to lead examined lives.